All right. Looks like we're now live. Going to start a few minutes earlier than scheduled because we've already got some good questions lined up here for the December 2023 Ask Me Anything session. Beautiful drab day outside here in Milwaukee downtown. So let's start with this first one, which is pretty rich in terms of what we can say by way of answer. It's from William Edwards. Do you think the word evil has lost its utility, especially in political discourse, where it's often used to create a basic political divide? Where is the conceptual use of evil most useful for you outside of expressly theological discussion? So, no, I wouldn't say it's lost any of its utility, except for people who like to claim that there is no such thing as evil or, it consists in demonizing your enemies. Evil covers a wide range, right? And sometimes it's synonymous with badness. Sometimes it's understood as like something distinctly moral. There's not just one kind of evil or one essence of evil. So I don't think it's lost its usefulness at all. And people have been making this kind of complaint about, you know, making out your opponents in political discourse to be evil for centuries and centuries. So it's not something radically new. So why would that actually change the usefulness of the term? I mean, we use it in philosophy and moral philosophy all the time. You could think about going all the way back to the Greeks and Romans. We have the kakos and we have poneria, wickedness. And there's, sort of, it's not as if there's like a specifically philosophical and then a specifically theological or religious thing. It's a blend, a spectrum across the way. And in religious texts, you're going to find people using evil not necessarily in a theological sense. In Latin, it's malum, right? And so, we can say that certain things are, in fact, evil. And it hasn't lost its usefulness. What it's, if anything, and I don't really think that our situation is much different than 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago. If anything, it's been sort of like, it's been turned into something that people who are afraid to talk about evil or who see people misapplying the term evil get all worked up about and try to say, oh, we can't use that term anymore. But we don't have to accept other people telling us that we can't use a term or the term is no longer useful or anything like that. That's up to us to decide. I have zero problem saying that there are many evil things, and even that we sometimes end up committing evil, even if we have good intentions, or we end up collaborating with or cooperating with evil. And I'm not going to say that everybody should have that particular stance, but you might find yourself a little bit freer in terms of your thought and practice if you do. So, all right, Henry says I'm having trouble understanding Tillich's conception of God as the ground of being. Any thoughts or opinions on his systematic theology? Because there's a much wider range of systematic theology. Also, happy belated anniversary to you and the wife. So I haven't read Tillich for decades. I never found him really all that profound. He seemed to be somebody who was, using existentialist ideas in what struck me as kind of a more superficial way than many of the other people out there, whether philosophers or theologians like himself. And so I never found his thought really that interesting or attractive. So I don't actually have any opinions or views on that. But if you want to delve into his theology, by all means, go ahead. His notion of God always struck me as a little bit, what would you say, abstract and metaphysical rather than rich and robust in its conception. So, but I could be wrong about that. I just don't think I'm going to spend much time on Tillich, given all the other people I can spend my time on in the present. Lapse 9 Continuum, been enjoying your prolegomena videos. In one of the prefaces to the first critique, Kant seems to suggest we might have a kind of practical access to things in themselves, thoughts. Yeah, I mean, he says that in the essentially the third part of the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals, right? We are things in themselves, and so we're not just isolated subjects, but in our freedom, we can know more about how things stand, right? We can't know in any sort of scientific sense because that's the world of phenomena. But we certainly can try to understand via reason, Vernunft, um, what the thing in our the things in themselves that are us are, as we could say, locuses of freedom, as things that have a will, things that can reason, right? Do we ever get a practical access to things in themselves, like objects out there in the world, like this cup, which is a phenomenon? Kant says no. We experience it through perception, bringing to bear the categories of the understanding on it, and that's about as good as it gets. We can like do science on it, and we can certainly have our practical concerns like is it going to hold my coffee and keep it warm, and because of its shape keep from spilling, which is why my wife uh, ordered these cups, because I one time too many spilled a regular coffee cup. Kant says no, so I see that as kind of a dead end. And maybe we don't need to try to get too much out of Kant that isn't really there. Is a broader idea with philosophers. With Kant, you get the system that he lays out, and either you buy into it or you don't. But we never really get access to the things in themselves. Not even in some sort of afterlife or something like that. All right. Mark is here. Hey, Greg. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well. Have a good month. Yeah, you too, man. Paul Jackson, what is existentialism, or what at least is a good way to characterize it? Was Sartre right that what the existentialists have in common is the belief that existence precedes essence? No, Sartre was not right about that. And Sartre wasn't saying that it was the belief that uh, existence precedes essence, and he actually was sort of kicking other people out of the existentialist spectrum, including his nemesis Gabriel Marcel, who was using the term existentialist long before Sartre was, and doing his work, more than a decade before Sartre. Sartre was actually trying to take over the term, and you know, you shouldn't use his definition because it's already a polemical definition. When he came out with that, Heidegger responded with the letter on humanism. Heidegger is a major existentialist who's like, well, if that's what you mean by existentialist, then I'm not an existentialist. And same with Marcel. But why should we believe Sartre's bullshit on this matter, right? Why should we take his side? It's not as if Sartre was ever like the spokesperson for existentialism, because there wasn't any. Existentialism is a loose movement that begins in the 19th century, with roots going all the way back into antiquity. So there's like what we call proto-existentialists along the way that include Augustine of Hippo and Blaise Pascal and other people like that. And then it includes these interesting authors like Søren Kierkegaard and Fyodor Dostoevsky, Friedrich Nietzsche, arguably, some of Leo Tolstoy's stuff, and Henrik Ibsen, and August Strindberg, and although Strindberg is coming a little bit later, and Chekhov as well, right? Have definite existentialist themes to them. And then, by the beginning of the 20th century, we have, Lev Shestov, and we have Miguel de Unamuno and Ortega y Gasset, and we have, these great German language existentialists, some of whom are not ethnically German, like Kafka, right? And We have Rainer Maria Rilke, and we could go on and on. And so it's not a simple thing, and we don't need to give a single characterization of it, let alone a definition. What we can say is there's these like themes that existentialists tend to have in common. It's more like a family resemblance definition, if you're familiar with that idea, where we say, there's like about 10 or so different big themes, and not every existentialist will necessarily embody all of those in their work, but these are the things that tend to draw people through this and what they tend to express. For example, philosophizing or theorizing about things from your own concrete situation. Is that unique to existentialism? Not really. But it certainly is something that characterizes existentialist philosophy, literature, drama. We could go on and on and on, right? So, you don't actually have to have a characterization that tries to encompass everybody. That's counterproductive if you want to understand existentialism. Counting cards, were you a serious young man? I was serious when I was a young man, but I also like to joke around a lot. So, I think the question is more like, well, what were you serious about? And for a long time, it was exercise, and competitiveness and things like that. I also was serious by the time that I got to graduate school. I was pretty serious in my studies. Even as an undergraduate, I could be serious about it from time to time. I seriously wanted to be a writer. I guess I'm kind of a writer. I was serious about the relationships and love affairs that I had, some of the time and sometimes not, right? So yeah, but it sounds like serious young man. That's got that ring of being like a moniker that somehow is supposed to mean something big. So I don't know. Propylene, what was your favorite book to read in your teenage years? I don't think I had a favorite book as such, but I certainly did have a lot of books that I enjoyed reading. Um, I got into sci-fi and fantasy when I was pretty young, all the way in elementary school, and that continued through into my teenage years. So Roger Zelazny, Philip Jose Farmer, Ursula K. Le Guin were some of my favorite authors at the time. But there were many others. Stephen Don. I might be mixing it up. Who's the guy who had the Dorsey stuff? I really liked his stuff, and I like Keith Laumer's Bolo series. So you could say there's some military science fiction mixed in with that. And Gordon Dickinson, that's who it is, the Dorsey or Child series stuff. I was going to say Stephen Donaldson, and I knew that wasn't right because he's a totally different author. And there were lots of like Lord of the Rings spin-offs that I kind of liked. Obviously Tolkien, you know. So there were lots of that sort of stuff. I was reading some kind of philosophical works at the time. I think the first book of philosophy that I ever read was Camus' Myth of Sisyphus, but I didn't understand more than like 1/10 of what I was reading at the time, right? So, uh, all right. Pipeline. I saw John Vervecke's series Awakening from the Meaning Crisis and saw him at Stoicon 23. Do you know his work? And if so, what's your assessment of his philosophical take on the meaning crisis? So first of all, I'm not a fan of Vervecke, and I'm not a fan of the mindfulness stuff either. Um, and so I'm not a good person to ask about this. The meaning crisis, that's been around for 2 centuries. So he didn't coin that. He's just kind of hopping onto that and using a concept that many of us already had and have been working with for a very long time. And he, gives it a little bit of a twist, right? And there's, people like that. There's plenty of them out there doing that. I've never found him particularly interesting or insightful. Other people seem to, but that's sort of like saying, I like this kind of music, you like this kind of music, because different strokes for different folks. If you're into his stuff, probably not going to be that much into my stuff. Um, Meta judge, will you ever make videos on Muslim philosophers? Probably not, because I've talked about this many, many times. I don't read Arabic. I like to work on texts where I can go back to the original. And why should I do videos on people that I'm not particularly well versed in? There's literally thousands of people out there who could be creating YouTube videos. Why shouldn't I stick to the stuff that I'm better at and respect the division of labor and let other people who are scholars, of Muslim philosophy or Islamic philosophy, why don't they do it? You should be asking them to do it rather than asking me if I'm going to do it. Same thing goes for, Indian philosophy, everything from the Indian subcontinent. I don't read Pali, I don't read Sanskrit. I teach some of that stuff in classes, but I don't teach it as an expert. I teach it as somebody who has limited competence in it. Same thing with classical Chinese philosophy. Um, I learned a little Mandarin, but that's not enough to be able to read the Tao Te Ching in the original classical Chinese in some sort of critical edition. So it's smart for me not to do that sort of thing because it leaves the room open for other people to do that kind of work. All right. Reese Barker, question on miracles in quotation marks. Not sure why. My own thought, even if you see miracles happen, that doesn't entail a supernatural cause. Just because something isn't understood doesn't entail its supernatural thoughts. Yeah, sure. Also doesn't mean that there isn't a miracle. I mean, you seem kind of dogmatic about this. Um, who's telling you that there's miracles that just because we don't understand what something is that counts as a miracle? I mean, Insane Clown Posse says that about magnets and stuff like that, but that doesn't seem to be what most people mean when they say miracles. Oh, I just don't understand it, so it's a miracle. And that certainly isn't what it is in the philosophical literature, so that's kind of a non-starter right there. But it sounds like something you gotta work out on your own probably. Um, all right, just skipped a little bit. Here we go. Um, Meta Judge, what conception of the Trinity do you subscribe to? The Trinitarian one. I mean, you're gonna lay out a whole bunch of different options perhaps, because then I could pick among those. William Zen says, "Can you give me some suggestions on how to do philosophical detective work on philosophers, like you mentioned in your video on originality, like creating a Nietzschean theory of emotions?" So, what I've sometimes called philosophical detective work, as a description of what I do, is where you take an author's work which includes very often their correspondence with other people, and you have to read through all of it and study it and look for the correlations between it. And so you can do this sometimes with a single work. Like I've done this with stuff in Thomas Aquinas's Summa Theologia, where, like if you want to understand this topic, which is officially talked about here, you got to look at these discussions over here and here and here. I've done that with Aristotle, piecing together, for example, a coherent theory of anger or how the passions play out in social discord, what's called stasis. I've done a lot of this with Anselm. I've done some of this with Thomas Hobbes, and the way you do it is just what I described. You study their works, you study their works some more, you study them some more, you take some notes if that helps you. You like mark certain things, you like start storing stuff up in your head, and then you get fascinated with some sort of topic that you think is within them. So, like, Nietzsche on now, Nietzsche doesn't have a theory of the emotions. You could say a theory of the affects, which is a bit broader, which includes drives and stuff like that. But I don't see a theory of the emotions as such in Nietzsche. But if you do, well, then start digging around. You're going to have to read everything that you've got available from Nietzsche that's relevant, and start correlating things. Start looking for the same, you know, terminology being used, and you're going to have to read it in the German, or else it's not going to be feasible at all. So if you don't read German, maybe do Hume on the emotions instead, or some other author. But that's basically what it consists of. There isn't a method to it. There isn't like some sort of like, well, first you do this, then you do this. It's more like an activity that I do. All right, Ken, good to see you here. In relation to business ethics, would you recommend a specific business related place to start, or would you recommend delving into the philosophy of ethics in general? So it kind of depends, right? If you're like setting up a class on business ethics, which is a class I fairly regularly teach, and I've taught business ethics now, I think at 4 different institutions. And I've also taught other professional ethics classes like biomedical ethics, ethics for artists and designers. I've even done presentations to like the Wisconsin Paralegal Association, and I've done work with trainers with the American Psychological Association about how to implement and train people on their code of ethics and conduct. So broadly in professional ethics, you can say, is there a place to start? You've almost got too many places to start. So what I usually do, we've usually got like a textbook, and none of the textbooks are really great. They're all kind of inadequate in certain ways. I've actually thought about writing my own business ethics textbook that would be, in at least in my view, a little bit better put together than what we have available. And then I usually assign some articles, and we look at them. We look at the arguments in them. So one that we often begin with is Milton Friedman's 1970 essay, "The Ethical Responsibility of a Business is to Increase Its Profits." And we don't do that because it's the basis for business ethics. We do it because this is like representative of many people's screwed up, wrong-headed viewpoint on responsibility, right? And so we want to look at why people view things this way. And we usually start out with kind of the crappy theories first, like egoism or moral relativism, right? And then we start getting into um, you know, more robust theories like utilitarianism or varieties of deontology or virtue ethics and ethics of care. We hit libertarianism on the way, but that's kind of a deficient theory when it comes to moral philosophy. But then we read other stuff along the way. So if you're doing like biomedical ethics, you're obviously going to read stuff that has to do with those kinds of issues and cases. If you're doing business ethics, you're probably going to look at like hiring and firing, and CEO compensation, and how you treat suppliers or how you treat customers and matters like that. um, as well as like, who bears the negative costs for things that aren't really covered in things what we call externalities. Um, but there isn't like one right way to start. There's like so much stuff out there that you could dig into. There's lots of great ways to set up a business ethics class. Now, if you want to study it on your own, you can kind of like move around. There's a lot of great blogs out there. There's people who specialize just in business ethics, and you can follow them. There are some people who do business ethics, and they've got like a particular take on it, right? So like Norman Bowie is a great example, Kantian business ethics and Kantian capitalism. Or Robert Audi is another major thinker, who I teach some selections from in my classes as well. All right. Anthony Summers, I enjoy heavy metal for music and style, but I enjoy the lyrics too. I always found Megadeth lyrics thought provoking. What metal band explored interesting concepts in your opinion? I mean, tons of them, you know. Megadeth, one of my favorite lines is actually from Peace Sells Who's Buying. I've used it as a motto. And sometimes even in like meetings, if there's a new way, I'll be the first in line, but it better work this time, right? That's a semi-profound insight about social transformation, right? We want things to move towards the good. We want to reduce corruption. We want to make things work better, be more rational, but it better work. It better not just be some, airy fairy, make everybody feel good kind of thing. Things better work. There's you could pick all sorts of metal artists who are raising interesting questions, problems about the human condition, about how society is set up, when we ought to be aggressive, when we ought not to be, what is valuable in life and all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. All right. Gary, hello, Professor Sadler. What are your thoughts on Carl Schmitt's concept of the political and more broadly as Hobbesian tendencies? I don't think he's really that close to Hobbes on a lot of stuff, and I think that Schmitt has been kind of oversold. The insights that he has don't strike me as really that profound. We reduce things down to friend and enemy, and we have states of exception. Yeah, okay. So what? Um, People have been pointing that sort of thing out long before Schmidt was around. Um, but he I think in part because he gets engaged with by other continental thinkers, and he had this association with the Nazi regime. He gets a lot of mileage out of that, but the ideas aren't really that radically new or profound. So um, that's my take on him. Sean Hamill, I've heard you talk in your videos about being a mathematics major. What relation does mathematics have to philosophy in your view? Have you ever had an interest in the philosophy or history of mathematics? Yeah, I was a mathematics and philosophy major, so I double majored. And there's plenty of overlap, right? I mean, you got the field of logic and you got foundations of mathematics, and then you've got, philosophy of mathematics, which is kind of dealing with questions like, well, what the hell's mathematics up to? What are its objects? And sure, yeah, I got into all that kind of stuff. We actually did an entire seminar when I was an undergraduate, spending a semester on the book Gödel Escher Bach by Hofstadter. So yeah, there's plenty of overlap. Where people kind of go wrong is in thinking that you're going to do more with math than you actually can, and this is a common thing for philosophers. I mean, you can look at Rene Descartes' early work, where he thinks that mathematics is like the key to everything. Obviously, doesn't believe that by the end of his life. Um, so it's good to study mathematics. And when we say mathematics, it's nice that the British call it maths rather than just math, right? Because we often use these big terms like mathematics, science, as if they name just one single thing rather than a whole bunch of interconnected things, right? Mathematics is arithmetic and computation and prob and stats and geometry and linear algebra and all these different sorts of things that can be interfaced with each other, but they're not all the same, right? And different people specialize in different areas of it. I got really good when I was a math major at being able to like see how to set up a proof or how to solve a problem. But as I got better at that, my abilities in basic computation started to flag. And so I would work with a guy who just like could not see how to do stuff, but he didn't make mistakes in computation. And we were a great team together um, when we'd work on projects and stuff. So, I did a good bit of work on that sort of thing. My senior thesis was on isometric truth self-referential statement groups that I found a mathematical functional modeling for, and showed that they all reduce if they're truth self-referential and not covering other variables, either to the liar's paradox or which can be well, I'll tell you what it can be modeled as in a moment, or just to a tautology. And then my writing sample for graduate school was showing that that could actually be uh, modeled geometrically as a Möbius strip. So yeah, lots of cool stuff. Ultimately, I found it kind of sterile, you know. So all right, roughly, Bumble has a tricky one here. In what ways would you say Christ fits or doesn't fit Aristotle's conception of the magnanimous man from the Ethics, or have any medieval philosophers commented on this topic? I mean, the magnanimous man for Aristotle is the person who, within their society, deserves great honor and expects great honor. And so this is often translated by Christian authors and opposed by them as pride, right? Not being humble. So it really depends on what picture of Christ you're working with. It's not as if all Christians have one single unitary conception of who this Christ figure was. And there's often a lot of emphasis on humility, which Aristotle does actually discuss to a certain extent in the discussion of magnanimity in Book 4 of the Nicomachean Ethics. But it's not quite the same thing as what Christians are developing into humility later, because the humble person for Aristotle is not virtuous, but they're not vicious either, like the vain or the the self-deprecating person, the person who, the small-souled person. They demand little because they realize they deserve little, right? So, and are there medievals who talk about this direct contrast between the Aristotelian magnanimous, possessing all the virtues, lofty, high up there person, and then Christ as a particular model, as opposed to just other non other virtuous but non magnanimous or non prideful people? Yeah, I mean, I think you can find discussions in, um, medieval scholastics once Aristotle makes his way back in. The touchstone for earlier medieval Christian writers is going to be, um, what they're getting of Aristotle is coming through um, people like Cicero and Seneca, who are being copied out, but those are eclectic or Stoic writers, right? And also to some degree through Augustine, although Augustine doesn't talk an awful lot about Aristotle, right? And then other authors who do know Aristotle, sometimes even are like Aristotelians, like John Damascene, right? So yeah, there's discussions out there. It's not as cut and dried as some people want to make it out to be, like, the ancients were all about pride and the great man, and then the Christians came along and they all believed something completely different. Way more complicated than that, I'd say. So, all right, Christian Robles, what are your thoughts on Nietzsche's will to power? I often see it as a means through which some people justify abuses of power. Nietzsche's praise of Napoleon comes to mind. Um, so yeah, I mean, people are going to use and abuse other philosophers' notions. So you got like three different questions there, actually. What do I think of Nietzsche's will to power? I mean, I think that that's fundamental to Nietzsche's metaphysics. I think Heidegger's right about that. And if you want to understand Nietzsche, it's an absolutely irreplaceable and central concept, way more important than like the eternal recurrence of the same or some of the other things that come in with it. And it's a very complicated topic in Nietzsche. So to answer the second question, I often see it as means through which some people justify abuses of power. I mean, do you see a lot of people using Nietzsche to justify abuses of power? Most times people just abuse power and find the easiest excuse at hand. They don't usually say, well, Nietzsche says. So you must move in some very different circles than I do. And Nietzsche's praise of Napoleon, I mean, Nietzsche praises all sorts of people. Who cares, you know? Are you saying that Napoleon was a bad guy and, abused power? I mean, in a certain sense, from a Nietzschean perspective, you can't really abuse power, right? If you have the power, that's what makes you powerful. You find out because you dominate other people. So, to criticize Nietzsche from that perspective is sort of like what Nietzsche does with the Stoics, criticizing them for not being him. That to me, that's kind of as another term I used earlier, a non-starter, right? Gary, how would you know that you're in love, and how can you be in love with someone and still have doubts about them in a relationship? I mean, let's answer the second question first. How can you be in love and still have doubts? You could realize that you're in love with somebody who's a screw up. You can be in love with somebody and there could be all sorts of red flags. This happens all the time. And you could be like, well, this may be a tragic situation where I love somebody and I wish that I could be with them, but they're a hardcore drug addict. Our life is not going to work out great. Or, maybe I shouldn't be in love with them, but I am. I have these feelings and I know that they're an abuser, you know, or they're a terrible person in some other respect, right? That's not hard to fathom, right? That's easy. We often experience stuff like that. Conflicts between values and emotions. That's a lot of our life. How would you know that you're in love? There's no like, single telltale signs because being in love doesn't name just one single thing. There's lots of different theories and understandings of what it means to be in love. For some people, it's basically a euphemism for I want to have sex with you. Other people, it's, this selfless devotion. There's all sorts of other things that we call being in love. And we sometimes even use it of not just people, but like I'm in love with this music that comes from this band, right? We're using it in a metaphorical sense there. So there isn't any single criterion for knowing that you're in love, but there's things that function, you could say, as signs that are fairly traditional. We talk about having butterflies in our stomach. Now, what exactly that feels like going to vary from person to person, right? So um, maybe you want to look at what other people say about what being in love looks like. But I mean, there is one good question. How do you know that you're in love and not just infatuated with somebody? Time. Does it wear off? Um, how long does it last? You know, that's one of the ways that you can tell. I mean, if you do get to have sex with them, are you still in love with them after you have sex with them, right? Okay. Boogie Reverie. I've been going back to Plato and some secondary literature. Platonist Thomas Taylor's commentaries seem controversial to some scholars. Have you read them or found them useful? I don't even know who Taylor Thomas is. I don't spend a lot of time with secondary literature because I have, limited time and I spend it on primary literature. So I don't know who he is, why his stuff is controversial. Um, I don't have anything to contribute there. Gilbert Bates, interested in self-deprecating comedy. Is there a relationship between healing trauma, vulnerability, authenticity, and turning that into humor? I mean, there could be. There's no necessary relationship between it, right? Some people could be working on uncovering their traumas and figuring out how to live a more authentic life in light of them. And it might have nothing to do with comedy or humor. I myself find that it's often helpful to laugh at things that seem grim or biting, but that seems off-putting to many other people. Sometimes they feel like you're making fun of their situation, right? Even when you're just like laughing about your own situation. So, you know, I don't see a connection though between self-deprecating comedy and healing trauma, vulnerability, and authenticity. Self-deprecating trauma could actually be the opposite. It could be about, lacerating yourself over and over again to please some other people, making little of yourself so that other people can feel good about themselves. There's no necessary connection between them. Mistful HD, what do you think about AI replacing jobs? So a big topic. Some jobs will be replaced, other jobs won't. I mean, that's probably the easiest response to that. And then we start getting into more specifics. We always have to ask, well, why would AI replace a particular job? What does it supposedly do better than a human being? And then, do we need human beings to like check up on it and make sure it doesn't screw things up? I mean, think about the self-driving vehicles. They're not doing too well, are they? You still need, human governance in some respect. There were all these predictions that by now we were going to have self-driving semi-tractor trailers, and it was going to revolutionize the trucking industry, which is in a whole other mess right now, right? Having to do with lowering the wages and a lot of the older truckers leaving it, and less and less training for younger truckers, and technological transformation due to like uh, governors and drivers logs and cutoff points and stuff like that. But we haven't seen a massive replacement of human beings with AI in that respect yet. We are seeing it in other areas, but you got to be kind of careful with the AI, right? AIs, they aren't really intelligent. And so if you're going to use it to like prepare your legal briefs, as one lawyer did, you got to watch out for it making stuff up. you know and if you bring it before a judge, you might get yourself in deep trouble and lose your case and get brought up on ethics charges with the bar association as a result. So I think that a lot of the major predictions and fears about AI replacing our jobs need to be, they're not complete bullshit, but they need to be qualified considerably. I also think too that maybe a lot of people who are like super bullish about AI, they're like, "Oh, it's going to be amazing." Maybe they should sit down and shut up, right? And maybe also the AI doomsayers who are like, "AI is going to kill us all." Maybe they should sit down and shut up too. Maybe we should listen to the people who are more in the middle and are not espousing these sweeping assertions about AI and are being a little bit more careful with what they have to say about it, right? Um, Paul Jackson says, "What is the relationship between gameplay, chess, sport, and art? A common response to gameplay that was poetry and motion. Thanks always." I mean, poetry and motion is a nice trope, um, but it doesn't really mean much of anything anymore. People have used it so much. Um, I mean, you could say that with game playing, there could be creative aspects, but art and the creative, endeavors that we associate with it and playing games are kind of two different sorts of activities, right? They may involve similar things like fluidity and grace and beauty, but they have different points to them, right? Games could be about entertainment. They could be, but it's all about the interplay with the other people, and maybe they're also about competition. Doing art, appreciating art, you could turn that into games, but it's not a game as such, you know. So I don't really see that many interconnections myself. Um, all right, Prague's Productions. There's tons of videos on Islamic philosophy. The people that ask just have to look in the right places. Yeah, that's true. I mean, a lot of times people ask me to do stuff that other people are already doing, like, um, "Hey, you did the half-hour Hegel series. Are you going to do that for Hegel's Science of Logic?" Well, why the hell should I do that when Stephen Holgate has like an entire series on it with the Hegel Society of Great Britain? And you just Google Hegel Science of Logic videos and they'll come right up, right? So, yeah, I mean, the people that are asking for Islamic philosophy or Chinese philosophy or Indian philosophy. There's plenty of stuff out there. I mean, if you want good stuff on Chinese philosophy, there's Brian Van Norden, who when I'm teaching that stuff in my classes, I have my students watch his videos, right? I don't have to make my own for that. So, all right, vegan sports bar. Did Socrates believe that virtue and wisdom could be cultivated, or that the amount of virtue a person has is predetermined? So, no virtue ethicist, if they're a virtue ethicist, throughout history believes that the amount of virtue a person has is predetermined. And as a matter of fact, most virtue ethicists throughout time believe that you don't start out with any virtue. Or if you do, it's at best tendencies that were what Aristotle called natural virtues. So Socrates thinks that of course you can cultivate virtue. That's what you ought to be doing, right? Instead of just saying, oh, well, maybe the gods will give it to me or nature will give it to me, right? So that's a pretty straightforward one. I would be surprised to see anybody who's seriously reading Plato or Xenophon, which is where we get our ideas of Socrates from, somehow coming to the conclusion that there's a predetermined amount of virtue that a person has, in Socrates' thought. Brother Dulla, have you read much by Edward Said, and would you consider doing a series on his work Orientalism? The only thing I've read by Said is his book Orientalism, and I don't have any plans to hit on it in the future. But I will say this: if somebody wants to commission, and what that means is ponying up the money for the work involved, commission a series of core concept videos on Edward Said's Orientalism, then I'd be willing to do it, because people are always asking, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? I already got plans, Right now I'm doing Immanuel Kant's Prolegomena, and I am doing a detour. This month I'm doing a single commissioned video on Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus Part 1 on the concept of the body without organs, but that's because somebody is willing to pay for my time and energy to be taken from one thing and put onto another. So, people can reach out to me at any time about that sort of thing. Black Prairie, how does one leave the notion that science is the only way to truth? Other cultures have their own ways of interpreting reality, but I feel science often dismisses or discredits them as illusion. So there's no such thing as science per se. There's the sciences, and many of them are quite different from place to place and time to time. So, we don't even have to get into like the social sciences. Think about the transformations in physics in the last 200 years. Is physics today what it was 200 years ago? Does it name the same thing? No. So there's no like capital S science out there to dismiss other cultures' ways of interpreting reality. And good scientists don't think that science covers all of reality anyway, right? I mean, there's plenty of great scientists out there that you can read that will say, well, we can talk about this, and over here, now we're in metaphysics or religion or something else, right? So, I think what you're working with there is kind of a caricature of science. So you probably want to not be as dismissive of science itself in that way, right? All right, Patrick made a super chat, but it just says one. So I'm guessing that's praise of some sort. Thanks for that. That's very nice. Let's see what the next question is. Oh, here's a good one. Rexel, any big plans content wise for the channel this 2024? Yeah, a lot of the big plans are like continuing on with the big plans from the past, right? So I managed to finish the half hour Hegel project, and I need to like completely bring that to a close before I start doing other similar close reading projects. And the next book that I'm going to do is a short one, Anselm's Proslogion, which it's a great short little work of Christian metaphysics and You could even say moral theory to a certain extent. And then I want to do Descartes' meditations with the same sort of careful, let's, line by line, look at what the text is actually saying. In Anselm's case, obviously, we're working from Latin, right? In the case of Descartes' metaphysics, we're looking closely at Descartes' own Latin text and the French translation, which is not by Descartes, of the metaphysics, and then the, sort of standard English translation as well. So those are kind of big plans. I'm continuing on doing these interviews in the Ideas That Matter series with people that I think have something really interesting to contribute. Got a lot of guests lined up for that. Um, got a lot of books to review. I'll be doing more, personal videos as well. Videos about advice. I've got a lot of core concept videos on different thinkers that I want to get to. I probably won't finish up Kant's Prolegomena this month, but that'll bleed into 2024. And then, I'm teaching an existentialism class in the spring, so I've got to produce some more videos for that on certain texts and authors. Um, Holding events like this. But I don't have any. I mean, I've thought about doing like some video essays. We'll see how ambitious I get. With me, the biggest constraint is always time. Um, do I have the time to actually get things accomplished, right? Uh, Mohammed says, which book did Alistair McIntyre talk primarily on political philosophy? There wasn't a book. There's all sorts of books going way back before After Virtue, where he talks about political philosophy. Sometimes he's reviewing other people's political philosophy. Like if you read his A History of Ethics, it is about ethics, but it is also social political philosophy. He's got social critique and things like Against the Self Images of the Day. He's got, all sorts of political implications in the tetralogy After Virtue, Whose Justice, Which Rationality, Three Rival Versions of Moral Inquiry, and Dependent Rational Animals. And he's got all sorts of great essays in his selected essays. I think volume two is on ethics and politics, if I remember right. So there'd be a lot of stuff in there as well, and that's already a lot, but that'll get you going, right? Um, all right, Labs 9 Continuum. Do you think participating in an online grad program might be better or worse in any way than going to classes in person? Totally depends on the program. Totally depends on the student. Some people don't do well in online settings, and they really need that personal face-to-face interaction. Some people do better in online settings, and the good thing about online settings is you can do it from anywhere, right? You don't have to have a residency there in New York or Chicago or wherever else it's going to be. And so that's one of the attractive aspects of it. There are some things that are harder to do online, but there's also a lot of cool stuff that you can do online. And even, like if you have an in-person program, there's absolutely no reason why there shouldn't be a massive online component to it right now. Like, classes these days, if they're real classes, they use course management systems. And, so I teach face-to-face classes, but I load them up with all sorts of, resources for my students, including like my videos and podcast episodes on the thinkers and texts and handouts and lesson pages and links to other resources. So it's not as if we have just completely online or just completely face to face as a modality difference anymore. But it also really depends on who's teaching, right? There are people who are great professors, but they don't know how to manage an online environment. And so if the bulk of the people in your program don't really know how to use online effectively, it's not going to be a great learning experience for you. And how do you test it out? I guess word of mouth, looking at reviews and stuff like that would be important. All right. John asks, do you have an opinion on Nietzsche as a philologist or linguist, right? A classicist, as an interpreter of the Greeks, whether it be about the Homeric question, the origin of tragedy, or the etymological history of the word agathos? I think, so I don't care at all about the Homeric question. That doesn't interest me, and I don't have an opinion on it. But the origin of tragedy, I mean, do I think Nietzsche's got it completely right? No, but it's pretty damn insightful in a lot of ways, right? Um, and well worth thinking about. Um, and the etymological history of the word agathos and its also associated things, because it's not just agathos, it's esthos, it's all sorts of other value terms that are being used there. Do we know if he's right about that? Not really, but he's telling an interesting, plausible story that figures importantly into his moral theory. But you can always ask, okay, so if he's wrong about this point or that point, what happens to the overall theory? Does it all fall apart? Or could he still be right about, different kinds of morality and, the more complicated way things play out in like SA2 and SA3 of the genealogy? If it's not completely clear that this is the case because of linguistics. So those are things to bear in mind, I would say. Um, Alan Hussey, have you engaged much with Deleuze? If so, I was wondering your thoughts on his conception of difference. Yeah, I mean, I've been reading Deleuze since I was an undergraduate. I prefer Deleuze to Deleuze and Guattari. I think that while they were great friends, Guattari is, in a certain sense, a bad influence on him, and the works that they write together are more like free association of ideas. And I think Deleuze is a more careful thinker when he's doing his own history of philosophy, or like the logic of sense, or essays, critical and clinical. And I've done videos on Deleuze, so you know that I've actually uh, engaged with Deleuze, because they're there in the channel. Um, I think that when it comes to a lot of concepts, in continental philosophy, late continental philosophy, they're often poorly defined and wind up, the word ends up doing a lot of work, right? So difference, what the hell is that exactly does that mean? Well, it means this and in this place and this and this place and this and this place. Same thing with Derrida too, by the way. Oh, there's difference and difference, right? And one is with an A and one is with an E. And you're like, all right, at a certain point, this gets a little too precious, and it's sort of like, this is what the fans are really into, but what can you actually do with that? Can you operationalize this in some way so that you can get something done? I mean, Deleuze talks about, philosophy is about making concepts. At a certain point, you got enough concepts and you don't need to make any more. And you should like stick with the ones that you got and explain them a bit better. And this is one of the weaknesses, I think, not just of Deleuze, but like that whole generation of continental theorists, I would say. So much experimentation, so much like, pushing the envelope, not enough systematic work saying, what the hell did I say back there? And how does that connect to this? Am I actually being consistent? Which tends to be less, sexy, less attractive, less interesting. And I think that these sort of ideas catch on with a lot of people because they can, make them do whatever they want. I mean, body without organs is another one of those things. You can put together a coherent concept of it, but go to just about anybody who is into Deleuze and say, what does the body without organs actually mean? And they'll like often spout passages at you. And you're like, that isn't what I'm asking you for. What does it actually mean? What can we circumscribe the concept so we can actually do something with it? Or is it just like a cool thing to say, you know? All right, Bartholomew says, "Have you read any Julius Evola?" No, I haven't. I haven't read any Evola at this point in time. I probably will down the line because I want to see what sort of nonsense bullshit he's on. And, the people that I see bringing him up usually are crackpots or, pretty gross people. Um, and I kind of want to know what he's actually saying. I suspect it's not really that profound, and I'm willing to bet that I'm going to read it and I'll be like, yeah, I've already seen this kind of stuff before. It's not that radically different than 19th century traditionalism, just with a couple other things mixed in. But I don't know. We'll find out. Luke says, oh, he's talking about art with somebody else. Steven says, been reading Deleuze and Guattari for a bit now, and despite his anti-Hegelian stance, I noticed some similarities to what I think is sublation. Could you explain that concept? So you mean Hegelian sublation. So sublation, Aufhebung, also translated in like a whole bunch of other different ways. Um, the best way to understand it is when something is being aufgehoben, sublated. What is essential in it is being carried forward into a higher state, and the stuff that's inessential is being kind of left behind, and it's being transformed in the process, but it's also being preserved in the process. Um, Now, is there something like that in Deleuze and Guattari? I mean, there's something like that in just about everybody. We call that synthesizing things. We call that like interpreting, right? So, I mean, anti-Hegelianism very often, same thing with Kierkegaard, right? Is not so much being anti-Hegel. It's being it's responding to the people of the time who are doing things in kind of a cookie cutter way with Hegel's thought, right? Hegel was a very important thinker for mid 20th century French philosophers because you got the existentialists who are reacting against Hegel, but also sometimes incorporating Hegel. For example, you see Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre talking about Hegel in their works. Then you got the Marxists who are rediscovering Hegel and saying the clue to understanding Marx is understanding, or at least early Marx is understanding Hegel, and can we bring these together? So right, you got those types, and then you've got the structural. Um, Linguistics and anthropology people, and they're probably using Hegel less, but sometimes they get a little fascinated with him as well. So it's understandable why Deleuze and Guattari are viewing Hegel as problematic. And there are some things about Hegel that are very problematic. Did history end? Is the whole system one big closed thing, or is Hegel sometimes kind of selling you BS? I think sometimes he is, right? So that's worth taking into account. Um, let's see here. Patrick, appreciate your work. Question about Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, second essay. Why does he think the questioning of the value of truth is so unanswerable and can lead perhaps to suicidal nihilism? I'd have to go back and take a look at that. I think that's more stuff that's coming up in the third essay than the second essay. The second essay is really primarily concerned with the origin of the bad conscience and looking at how the early two moralities, which aren't even just two because you've got the priest as a weird mixed figure in there as well between um, master morality and slave or herd morality, right? How that gets complicated by the debtor creditor relationship, which is economic but is also involved in culture. How the strong, who aren't the top strong, wind up being subordinated and then having to repress their instincts, right? And then the development of religion. In the third essay, we actually do get the threat of nihilism, right? In part because Nietzsche traces out, the aesthetic motif, which is found, ascetic rather, in first in religion, then in philosophy, then in the man of science, which by the way mirrors what the um, positivists like Comte were saying, the age of theology, metaphysics, and then positivism, right? And Nietzsche's saying that science, and this is not something radically new in the genealogy, it's already there in the Birth of Tragedy, that science practiced consistently is actually undermining itself and undermining values, and we're being left in this kind of wasteland, right? So that winds up being quite central. Um, Black Prairie, I'm going to start reading the history of sexuality. Any tips? Yeah, be kind of skeptical about Foucault's narrative that he's laying out there. It's a little bit, when you actually know the source text that he's bringing up, and you can compare it to other alternate histories of ethics, which is essentially what the history of sexuality is. You read some of his stuff and you're like, okay, that's a good insight, and then other stuff and you're like, yeah, come on, that ain't the case. You're really overplaying it there. So don't necessarily believe that just because he's brought together some texts and told an interesting story that things actually are the way that Foucault says that they are. I mean, there's some interesting key ideas that are being brought up there. He's sort of elaborating the technologies of the self idea, which you find discussed in other places. Um, and you got to have a certain kind of patience with Foucault, because he does like to throw a lot of material at you. So, all right. Woden says, "What do you think about philosophy of law? What do you think about the actual themes and problems are?" I don't know. Not an area that I actually work in, so that would be something that you should probably ask somebody who's a specialist in the field. Paul says, about I wrote a paper on the topic about art and sport, right? Okay, so that's good. Quinn, what do you think about Kant's thing in itself? Are there any ways it's still relevant in everyday life? I mean, how the hell would it be relevant in everyday life? You can't reach the thing in itself. So, and Kant thinks you don't need to try to reach the thing in itself. So, that's kind of a non-starter, right? It's I suppose if people get really upset and they're like, I can't truly know what my cup is or the coffee that I'm drinking, but that's more of an individual psychological problem than like a big philosophical problem that would need to be addressed. Um, so I'm not a conscience, so I'm not that worried about the fact that he says that we can't really know the thing in itself. Myself. All right. Patrick says, why couldn't you just think truth is valuable because it's useful for satisfying desires, for example? I'm just not sure I see the problem. I'm not sure what problem is being referred to there. There's no one single conception of truth, and there are lots of different theories of truth out there, all of which capture some aspect of it. We often say, like, correspondence, coherence, pragmatic, but there's earlier theories of truth as well. Anselm in his work on truth exists in thought, in language, in being itself, in the will, in action. Heidegger's got truth as unconcealing and stuff like that. So there isn't like a single conception of truth, and some truth is valuable because it's useful for things, right? Okay, so Patrick says, I meant Nietzsche's The Problem of the Value of Truth. There isn't a single. I mean, so when you read Nietzsche say things like that, you gotta like read into them, and you also have to think about the fact that Nietzsche is writing in a time where people are very, very, very optimistic about human beings' capacity through modern science to reach absolute truth, right? And that's being undermined. And so when people are wrongly committed to thinking that that truth is something wonderful and we can have it, and then you pull that out from them, they they often are at a loss, right? So there can be that. Zachary asked, defenses against egoism charge made against virtue ethics. Well, I mean, the best defense is, clearly the people who make that charge haven't read much virtue ethics. Aristotle's not an egoist. The Stoics aren't egoists. Plato's not an egoist. Just being, Aristotle has like a whole discussion of being self centered, a lover of self, literally, in the right ways and the wrong ways in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 9. So a lot of the people that are making those sort of charges, you don't have to take them that seriously because they don't know what the hell they're talking about, right? You ask them, well, what do you actually mean by egoism, and how do you see it applying in these ethics? I mean, clearly there's an other centered direction to classical virtue ethics. So where are you getting this from? Are you like reading contemporary reconstructions of virtue ethics that have nothing to do with Aristotle or the Stoics, or middle Platonists like Plutarch, or Christian virtue ethicists like Augustine? Um, or are you actually reading the authors who are virtue ethicists? Because it's pretty hard to find much egoism in the sense of like everybody should be selfish and you should always place yourself first, when Aristotle says, justice is a virtue, and justice is the whole of virtue, because it's each of the virtues directed towards another person, right? So I think a lot of the people that you'd be worried about there just don't know what they're talking about, right? All right, coming back, Muhammad says, "Who, in your opinion, are the best five philosophers now?" I wouldn't have any idea, and I don't really worry about best or rankings or stuff like that myself. Quinn, oh, I already did that one. Aldous says, "What to do with the loss of a loved one, like a heartbroken situation? I'm considering reinvestigating Plato's Symposium." Well, I don't know that that will be that helpful, um, unless your goal is somehow to transform the love that you had for the lost person into an appreciation of more impersonal things, because that's the trajectory in Plato's Symposium with the ladder of love. You move from beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, away from beautiful souls to what makes the souls beautiful, namely laws and institutions that shape the soul, which are now impersonal and societal, and then to the knowledges, the epistemae, which make those laws and customs and things work the way they do, and then finally to the form of the good, or the form of the beautiful, the ocean of beauty beyond being. I mean, if you can pull that off, you're not going to like be sad about your loss very long. But you can also, you can think about the image that you have of the lost person preserved within your soul. Seneca talks about this. Anselm brings that up. I've got a whole article on that from years back, talking about Anselm as a Neoplatonist in that respect, and that can be quite helpful. I mean, I lost the closest companion animal I've ever had in my life, Sassy, about a year and a half ago, and I think about her every single day, and I do so in a deliberate way to keep her here in my heart, and to bring her with me to places that I go, even when I'm like taking care of other cats. But that's a philosophical practice that you can do. So yeah, and we do incur soon. I mean, the thing is with life, everybody we know is either going to die before us, or we're going to die before them, or we're going to die at the same time. So we're going to lose if we stay alive for any given amount of time. We're going to lose people, and learning how to deal with that, and keep that what's valuable in their image or memory still with us. That can be quite good. You can love that. All right. Vedant says, have a disbelief in philosophical texts that seem like someone high wrote them, random word mix giving the that seems deep feeling without any practical use in life except intellectual amusement. Yeah, I mean that's probably legitimate. I mean, some people it is intellectual amusement that is a practical purpose in life, but and you can be a little bit too practical too. I mean, if you impose that on philosophy, the tendency is to cut off a lot of the stuff that'll actually help you have a deeper understanding of the philosophers. But yeah, I'm not a big fan of the free association, string a bunch of jargon stuff together myself either. Although I was when I was younger, you know. And then other people are like, well, what the hell does it actually mean? You know? And then I would be like, well, it means, and I wouldn't have an answer. And then I realized, well, I was kind of bullshitting around, you know. And that's part of what helped me move away from some of the contemporary continental thinkers, right? Um, all right, let's see here. Eric Metz, what do you think of there being an absolute truth as Jesus proclaims he is? Do you believe in the divinity and lordship of Jesus? Where does Jesus ever use the word absolute? I don't see that in any of the gospels. Um, that seems like a kind of non-starter to me, right? Um, Batu, if you could chat with one philosopher from the past, who would it be and what would it be the topic? So assuming that like, you know, they would speak English or I would have some universal translation device, because otherwise we probably couldn't talk. You know, there's a lot of people I would love to get to chat with. Um, you know, today, and might have different answers at different times. Maybe I'd say Marcus Tullius Cicero. I mean, he got to study with some of the greatest minds of his own time, representatives of important philosophical schools. He had this very cool project of he's going to like take Greek philosophy and put it into a Latin setting to show that you can do philosophy effectively in Latin. And he does so while being a lawyer, a statesperson, a family man, sometimes having to go into exile, you know, fighting in a civil war. So it'd be pretty cool to talk with him. I mean, he might not want to talk with me though. He might be like, "Who is this peasant? What the hell do I care about Gregory Sadler?" You know, maybe he'd try to mine my brain for like, you know, what contemporary society is like or something like that. Um, and Olivia, sorry for the loss of your cat and happy anniversary to you and your wife. Oh, thanks. Yeah, married 12 years. That's pretty good, you know. Andy and I have known each other since I was 15 and she was 14. We met in high school, but we didn't date in high school. We kind of shared, you know, circles of friends. She had a crush on me, but one of her friends called dibs and then didn't follow up. And then we met again in the 90s, flirted with each other, working in the same office building, lived in the same neighborhood here in Milwaukee, but we were going out with different people at the time. And then we connected up in the end of 2009 via Facebook. And then within a couple months, solely by writing to each other, fell in love, decided we wanted to make a life together, and then only began talking on the phone in March of 2010. And then, you know, started figuring out how we were going to actually live together and get married. So, all right. Hacker owned member, do you think there are compelling arguments for God? If not, then what do you think is the strongest argument for God? I'm not sure what you mean by compelling and strong in that case. If something isn't compelling, how is it strong, right? But do you mean compelling like everybody who hears that argument must be convinced? And it kind of depends on what you think arguments for God are supposed to do. I don't think that any of them really function in a vacuum all by themselves to convince people who are hardcore atheists that yes, there's a God. I think that they work within a fabric with other ideas and experiences and reflection by the person to decide whether or not they want to think there's something out there that corresponds to what people call God, but there's a lot of different viewpoints on what God is as well, right? So I think arguments can be quite helpful that way, but they don't do the job all by themselves, right? Um, Let's see. There's some Cyrillic letters here, so I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Can you name any philosophers, theologians who can be seen as successors to Blondel who are heavily inspired by his work? For myself, I've just discovered Norris Clark. Yeah, Clark knows Blondel. Um, Sure. I mean, there's Antonin Sertillange, right? There's the transcendental Thomists like Joseph Marechal, who writes, a really interesting piece in the 30s about Blondel and Husserl. There's Bernard Lonergan talks about Blondel. Um, there are a lot of the Nouvelle Théologie people are inspired by him. Henri de Lubeck, for example, major. He's not a student of Blondel as such, but major interlocutor and advancing his ideas within the realm of theology, but also doing a lot of his own stuff as well. So there's a ton of people out there, but you kind of have to look around to find them, and sometimes they won't directly say, well, this is an idea inspired by Maurice Blondel. I mean, it's interesting because Xavier Rinn calls Blondel the theologian of Vatican, or the philosopher of Vatican II, because Nouvelle Théologie and Transcendental Thomism both play an important role, and Blondel's a major player in both of those. John Paul II's Fides et Ratio. I want to say that it's one of Blondel's translators, Fiacre Long, who says that while Blondel is not mentioned in the document, the entire document is Blondelian in its structure and perspective. So, there's quite a few people, but you kind of have to dig to find them. All right. Let's see here. So Eric Metz says, Jesus says he is the way, the truth, and the light, and nobody gets to the Father except through me. Seems like an absolutist statement. Yeah, Seems is doing a lot of work there. So I would say that's a great example of you doing what we call eisegesis, reading stuff in that you want to find there rather than actually letting the text speak to you. You want to call that absolutist in some sense of absolute? Go ahead. But, you know, I don't think everybody has to buy that. Um, all right. Hacker own member. How much did you read per day when you were a student for philosophy? I'm self studying philosophy and following your lectures as well. Just don't know how fast I should be finishing books. There is no rule for any of that. And if that's where your attention is, you're screwing yourself over. You never want to be like saying, I need to read 50 pages a day or something like that, because they're not comparable to each other, even among literature, right? So I've got two books sitting here, two very different kinds of books. The Philokalia, and that's, got different people. Also, I'm doing some work on Maximus the Confessor with a student. So this has Theodorus, Maximus, Thalassios, John of Damascene, and um, Theognostos, and then Discourse on Abba Philemon. Each of these is a different text. Some of them read quicker, some of them read slower. This is a book of fiction. It's a slow going one because it's very dense. Erickson is kind of a cool, writer that way, but this reads a hell of a lot faster than the Philokalia. So you don't want to be measuring or assessing yourself in terms of how much you're reading per day. Leibniz actually, in one of his letters to somebody, talks about reading a philosophical book as if it were a novel, like he made his way through it so quickly. Different kinds of literature, different authors read at different paces. So, there isn't any like you should read this amount per day or anything like that going on. And how much did I read when I was in college or in graduate school? I don't have a clue. I mean, I didn't read the same amount every day. Some days I was doing some things more, some days I was not reading at all. Um, And I think it's not helpful to gauge yourself against other people. What you want to gauge yourself against is how much am I actually getting out of this text? And sometimes too, there's a bit of a side note. You might not get that much out of a text at the point that you're at. Like if you jump right into Hegel's phenomenology, which some people think they ought to do without, having read a lot of philosophical literature before that, it's going to be really slow and crappy going, and you're probably going to get discouraged and say, I can't figure out what the hell's going on here, So, you want to gauge your abilities to what it is that you're reading. Um, all right. Let's see here. AE, how important do you think poetic language is to the preservation of philosophy? I don't think it's important at all. Um, or should a philosophical work be a strict inquiry at all times? No, that's not it either. And it's not as if those are the two choices that we have, right? Um, All right, Vedant says, in a broader sense of life, how can philosophy help you instead of ideas like nihilism and hedonism, balancing your mental models? What philosophical ideas can make you a more analytically critical thinker? I don't know what an analytically critical thinker is, but and you could be a nihilist and be analytically critical, I imagine, in some sense, right? Or hedonist, you could be like, I need to really be critical about the pleasures and I pursue and the pains I avoid. So, um, nihilism and hedonism are philosophical points of view. Um, the remedy for them is think your way through them, whether they're really genuinely true or satisfying for you. Look at other people who approach those issues. Nietzsche can be helpful in that respect, I think. Um, and Olivia, if I recall correctly, you once planned to do a read through of Blondell's action after you finished Hegel. Is this still the plan? No, I talked about that earlier. The plan is next is Anselm's Proslogion, then Descartes' Meditations. And I never said I was definitely going to do Blondell's L'Action. I've said I'm thinking about doing core concept videos, which are not the same thing as close reading videos on Blondell's Action, a while back, and we'll see if that happens. Um, but if I'm going to do another big book, it would probably be something that more people are particularly interested in. Hegel's phenomenology, a lot of people are interested in it. That can be crowdfunded, right? Because my time is valuable. Um, Other works that could be similarly interesting would be like Sartre's Being and Nothingness, or Schopenhauer's World is Will and Representation, or Heidegger's Being and Time. But I'd be more likely to do Sartre's Being and Nothingness, not least because Schopenhauer's a great writer stylistically, but Sartre's a great writer as well. Heidegger is not, so. Um, all right. Impulsive, in the Derridian phase video, you mentioned wanting to write a book on 20th century continental philosophy. Is that still on the cards? Yeah, I've actually talked with a friend of mine about doing this together. I want to write a book about what in 20th century continental philosophy turned out to be silly bullshit and what turns out to be good ideas that we can use. And there's plenty, like with Derrida, there's plenty of silly bullshit that it's not valuable. We can leave behind, And then there's other things that are more interesting where we can say, okay, there's something genuinely here, something worthwhile thinking out. So yeah, but I've got a lot of different projects in mind, and we'll see which ones come to fruition. LSBG1, when learning a bunch of a bunch of philosophers lived, how would you do it? Do you try to remember their exact birth dates? I don't remember anybody's birth dates. Or maybe just the century they lived. What's the most practical here? There is no most practical here. This is not, people keep asking about, like, what's the one way to do this thing? What's the best way to do this thing? There aren't answers to those sorts of things. It depends on you and the kind of learner that you are and what works for you. It's sort of like asking, hey, Dr. Sadler, how do you journal? I don't journal. Ask somebody who does journal, Or how, like the reading thing. How many pages should you read a day? I don't know. Depends on you as a reader. There aren't hard and fast answers for these sorts of things. Um, Patrick, what do you think of some of the 20th century analytic philosophers who seem pretty dismissive of some questions in continental philosophy? Those who think the meaning of being is a non starter? I think they're kind of stupid. They're smart, stupid people, and why waste time on, thinking about smart, stupid people's statements? Just if you want to read continental philosophers, read those continental philosophers, or read analytic philosophers who actually do take them seriously, like Iris Murdoch and, John Wisdom. There's been a lot of bad blood between continental and analytic figures, but a lot of it is just a waste of our time. you know Life is short. If you want to think things through, there are myriad thinkers that you could be spending time on, and seeing if you can make any advance with them. Um, oh, Mark says, I heard the term scholactivism, scholar activism, dropped at a conference recently. Thoughts on the term? So that's an interesting one. I guess it would be like scholarly informed activism, or you're doing activism by the kind of scholarship that you're doing. So it's already got an ambiguity to it, doesn't it? Which, philosophy people probably like, because they like when terms can mean more than one thing, because then they can unpack it. It doesn't sound like a very, it doesn't come off the tongue like a great term. Scholactivism, I don't see it catching on, but I could be wrong. When it comes to that sort of thing, I'm often wrong. So I guess we'll see what happens, right? Um, all right, we're getting close. We're at 1:30 already, so let's see what we can finish up with. Um, Chaldean, I'm new to your channel. Does philosophy reject the existence of God? Seems like philosophers keep trying to figure existence out in rebellion about God. Well, I mean, read a bit more philosophy if that's what you think, because you're going to find lots of philosophers who think that God exists. So if your general impression is that philosophers keep trying to figure existence out in rebellion against God, not a hell of a lot of philosophers who say that. So I'm kind of curious about who you've restricted your reading to, right? Zachary, does the unity of the authentic moral virtues in Aristotle depend on the single intellectual virtue of phronesis, which creates them by repeatedly choosing the actions that form them in our character? That's part of the picture, but I mean, the whole idea of the unity of the virtues is a red herring. Nobody's got the virtues unified, you know. And this little assertion that to have one virtue is to have them all, whether it's in Aristotle or the Stoics, goes so clearly against our experience and against so many other philosophers, and against even what Aristotle says in other places and what the Stoics say in other places, that it's kind of a waste of our time. You're never going to have a unity of the virtues. I sure as hell aren't going to. And I wouldn't worry over much about some theoretical sage out there for whom that might be the case. Phronesis is important, but the virtues, the relationship between the virtues and phronesis is not that phronesis tells you everything and then the virtues just go and do it. It's They're peers. They're on the same level, at least for Aristotle, right? For the Stoics, virtues are forms of episteme, but they're knowledge of how to do something in a certain situation, right? Um, all right, let's see here. Mickey says, do you have or are you intending to do a lecture series on Camus' The Rebel? I would love to. That is a matter of finding the time. Um, I don't know that I'd do the whole of the work, because I don't know that everybody would be quite as. I don't know we get that much mileage out of like these more obscure authors who nobody reads anymore and Camus' take on them. But I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I think the next thing that I would do by Camus, first what I need to do is I never finished up with the myth of Sisyphus. So there's a lot of topics within the work that I haven't actually done core concept videos on, and I'm going to be teaching that again this spring because I'm teaching existentialism. So I got to finish out that series first. And then I thought, the next thing that I would want to do by Camus is actually Letters to a German Friend, which I think are really great. You know, he's writing to this German friend during the middle of World War II, about the difference between France and Germany and their mindset, and being vanquished, being the conquerors, and viewpoints on humanity in it. So that could be quite worth doing. But the rebel is very important too. I mean, a lot of people, they read Camus and they're like, where the real action is, man, it's the stranger and the myth of Sisyphus, which both deal with the absurd. But the rebel reworks this notion of the absurd. It's no longer suicide, it's murder. That is the question that's imposed by the absurd. And so it shows an evolution in Camus' thought. And the stranger is not Camus' point of view on reality. Meursault is an asshole, and Camus says that he is. If we want to find Camus characters who more represent who Camus wants us to be like, I think we need to look at like the plague more, right? So, all right, let's see if there's anybody else. Keldan has a clarification. I was reading Thomas Nagel as Albert Camus for school research papers. I'm not well read in philosophy to know every point of view. Well, you don't need to be well read in philosophy to know every point of view. Nobody is. It's impossible. But you certainly can have read a lot more than just Thomas Nagel and Albert Camus. If I was going to like say, give me some representative philosophers, those two sure as hell wouldn't be it. Um, you want to read, start at the beginning, read some Plato, and then see where you go after that. um, let's see, any other things that I've missed here. um, Again, in the Cyrillic, um, what do you think of McIntyre's talk about human dignity? Do you agree with him? If it's a recent talk, I haven't seen it. I'm sure, given that I've agreed with McIntyre about a lot of stuff, I probably agree with him. Zachary has a follow up, but isn't the unity of the virtues seen in Zeno? No, because we don't have Zeno, who held that temperance, courage, and justice are merely names for prudence in different areas of life. No, that's not that's, there's a lot of different things that the Stoics say about virtue. Don't try to rest it on one single thing, right? That's a seductive illusion. Um, they all could involve knowledge, but knowledge is not the same thing as prudence, is not the same thing as wisdom, right? So it's more complicated than that. But who gives a shit? If Zeno said that, what does it have to do with your question about Aristotle? You always want to avoid shifting the ground, right? If you're asking about X, you want to keep asking about X, not secretly be asking about Y that you bring in after somebody um, addresses that. I was just bringing the Stoics up as a stronger example of people who seem to be committed to the unity of the virtues, but in practice aren't. You know, nobody exemplifies the unity of the virtues. Like I said, it's kind of a red herring. You know. Um, New joints. Do you think some physics and metaphysics by Aristotle would be ideal to really get into being in time? No, there's nothing ideal to get into being in time. And you mean reading Aristotle's physics and the metaphysics sure can't hurt, but it isn't like it isn't the hermeneutic cue to being in time, because you we could just as well say reading Kant's First Critique, or Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, or pick whatever else you want. I mean, Heidegger is drawing from all sorts of sources and doing original work of his own. So, all right. Let's see here. Oh, Zachary wants to argue. That was a direct quote from Devetra, blah, 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 right? Who gives a shit? I mean, so your idea here is that you're gonna like proof text things. It's a direct quote from Introduction to Virtue Ethics Insights of the Ancient Greeks. So you're relying on a secondary source telling you what Zeno's saying. And if you, I mean, if you really were committed to saying what we think Zeno might have said, you'd be going to the fragments of the Stoics, right? Von Arnim, where if anywhere is stuff that might be from Zeno, it'd be in that text. You wouldn't be trying to bring up somebody else's thing. Again, this whole like unity of the virtues thing, people love to talk about that sort of thing, but you're not going to get much mileage out of it. You know, you're never going to realize the unity of the virtues, but you can still be virtuous, right? So, what the hell good does it do you to think that somebody is committed to the thesis of the unity of the virtues, which, by the way, nobody in virtue ethics, in actual virtue ethics texts prior to the 20th century, ever talked about it that way. You know, that's a sort of like 20th, 21st century reconstruction going back in there, and it's not very helpful. You know, so let's see what else. There was one other one. Oh, Chaldean, can you recommend some awesome philosophy books for a newbie like me? Yeah, I mean, Plato's dialogues, they're awesome. They actually turn people on to philosophy and get them to start pursuing it as a discipline. And you have the benefit of like having some really rich, great texts that you can read and other people have said things about, and other people later on are referencing Plato. So that could be a really wonderful starting point. When people ask me where should I begin with philosophy, I almost always say um, Plato. Why not? Right? It doesn't mean you have to read everything that Plato wrote, but why not start there? It's a common reference point. It's not, I mean, even Whitehead, who says, we could talk about philosophy as being footnotes to Plato. He clarifies that what he means by footnotes to Plato is Plato gave us raw material that we can work with. And later philosophers are still exploring some of these ideas that Plato brings forward. So that's a great place to begin. David says, Boethius turned me on to philosophy. I mean, we all get turned on in different ways. The first philosopher who I really like took seriously and maybe understood to some degree is probably Nietzsche, right? But we all come into philosophy in different ways, and there's no one single way to do it. Eric Metz says Plato's Republic is one of the greatest masterpieces to ever be written. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, um, but people like it. You know, there's many great masterpieces. I don't know that it's among the greatest or anything like that. There's no reason why we have to be, that hyperbolic in our praise of this stuff. There's many flaws with the Republic as well, as Aristotle pointed out in the Politics, as well as in the Ethics, talking about the form of the good. Um, but yeah, it's a good book. You know, I don't start people off on the Republic. I start them off on the Apology or the Meno, or the Gorgias or stuff like that. I think the Symposium is better stylistically, you know, but we all have different opinions about these sorts of things. So, all right. So this is a great place to end. We're about like 12 minutes after the normal time that we would finish up. So I've actually got another event to go to today. The American Philosophical Practitioners Association is going to be interviewing me as a guest in their Agora at 3 p.m. Central Time. So in about an hour and 15 minutes from now. So got to get something to eat and, check in about that. I'll see you. I've got some other events coming up this month. If you want to participate in them, you can see them in my calendar on reasonio.com or in my Facebook page. I put the events in there. So I will see all of you some other time. And it looks like we got to almost all of the questions, which is good. Probably missed a few here and there, but you never get them all. So I will see you all later on.